Welcome everybody to our panel today, and a really very warm welcome to our speakers who've generously given us of their time. We've invited 5 panelists from a range of organizations to talk about their experience doing research outside of academia. On the panel, we have Jude Brady from Cambridge University Press and Assessment, Stephanie Diepeveen from the Overseas Development Institute think tank, Ariella Huff from the House of Commons, Laura Kennedy from Samaritans, and Imma Ramos from the British Museum. My name is Diane Caldwell. I'm one of the careers consultants here at the Career Service. And my colleagues Jane Ansell and Pippa Ellis are also here to help me out today. So we're actually going to jump right into it. We're first going to start with each speaker introducing themselves and their careers, really. We've asked them to speak for 7 minutes each, up to 7 minutes, about such things as their pathway to working in a research role outside academia, how they've used or have used their research skills in their role, and then also, if they can, to give their top 3 tips to researchers considering this route. And then we'll move into some questions that I'll prompt them with into more of a panel discussion at that point. And then we'll hopefully leave plenty of time at the end for questions from the audience. So do feel free when we get to that point to put those questions, as I said, in the chat, or you can put your hand up and we can get to those as we go along. And then, as I say, there'll be the dedicated time at the end. So without further ado, we will move first into hearing from Jude Brady from Cambridge University Press and Assessment.
Great, thank you so much. First of all, thanks so much for inviting me to come and talk. So I'm Jude Brady, and currently I work for Cambridge University Press and Assessment as a researcher, but I consider myself to be a career changer. I started my career working as a secondary and sixth form teacher of English literature and language in London. And in my second year of teaching, I did an MA in education, and I did it part-time, and I loved Tuesday nights because I'd get on my bike, cycle across South London and arrive in the seminar room with the problems of the day buzzing in my head, the books to be marked, the photocopying to be done, the lessons to be planned. But I loved it. And for me, that really confirmed that I wanted to continue studying, continue with an academic path. And I knew that I wanted to do a PhD. I just didn't really know what in. So I continued on my teaching track and became a deputy head of a department. And that work was the most rewarding and the most challenging work that I've ever done. And it was in that role that I found the inspiration for my PhD, which was to look at teachers' working conditions in England. So with the facilitation of a scholarship, I was able to move to Cambridge. I left London, moved to Cambridge, and I started doing a mixed methods PhD at the Faculty of Education. And I found that as I was coming towards the end of the PhD, I was really hit with this challenge that I felt like I couldn't really find a job that valued my previous career history and valued the PhD skills that I'd gained. And I really felt that if I continued on an academic track, it was almost like my career history would be wiped and I'd have to start again. And quite frankly, I just didn't want to. And there were also some things about academia which were not going to suit my life at that point. Previously, or at a different point in my life, I would have been so excited to perhaps do some short-term contracts, to look at options about moving across the country or maybe living in different places in the world. But it wasn't going to suit my life at that point. So in many ways, that made things a bit easier for me because I could restrict my search. I could put down some parameters and say, well, I want to stay in Cambridge. I want to be near the fen cows, cycling along the river. I really like this city. So I was really looking at Cambridge or commutable distances, so London, and this was just pre-pandemic. So it was looking like I'd need to work from an office. So with those kind of parameters in place, I was thinking, well, a PhD in education, I had examined for Cambridge University Press and Assessment during my PhD, so I was aware of them and their work. And I saw a job coming up, which was called Assessment Manager. And that job really valued my teaching experience, it valued my undergraduate degree in literature, and it valued my PhD skills. For example, in that job, I was responsible for setting international grade thresholds for exams, developing clear and valid questions for assessments, deciding which text should appear on literature curricula, Also being able to enter the discourses about why certain literature goes on the curricula and the justification for it and the implications of that. So it was a good job and it was a good match. I have to be honest with you though, it wasn't my dream job, and I think I was harbouring a hope that it would lead to a research job. So within the organisation as an assessment manager, I started finding ways to become involved with research in a way that complemented my full-time work. And eventually this research job did come up and I was appointed to it. And I absolutely love my current job. I'm so happy. I feel like I use my research skills every day. I use mixed method skills in a whole variety of projects. Some of them are very theoretical, for example, looking at concepts of literary canon. Some of them are more market orientated, for example, looking at which books teachers across the world want to teach. Some of them are completely new topics for me, for example, looking at the reliability of auto-marking methods. And I am in the great position that I get to plan and design projects from the beginning right to the end, including dissemination. So I really enjoy that. So that's how I sort of landed where I am now. And I am very aware that I'm presenting this as a neatly packaged story with a happy ending. But I actually really want to emphasize that it wasn't that straightforward. And I really feel like I took the detour route. So in terms of top tips, I would say what I learned was be resilient. And the chapter of the story that I didn't tell you was that several months before my PhD was completed, a research job came up at Cambridge University Press and Assessment, and it was my dream job. And I applied, I thought I'd done a great interview, and I did not get that job. It was the right job, it was the wrong time, and I wasn't the right person for it at that time. I also have a colleague who applied for her current job 4 times before she got it. So I would say be resilient. Secondly, I learned to be flexible. I think to begin with, I was quite focused on the title of researcher, but I can really, and even though that does happen to be my current title, I can see very, very clearly from my current position that I would be so happy working in a whole range of other departments. I'd be really happy working in marketing. I'd be extremely happy working for Cambridge Partnership for Education, who do a lot of work with governments, working on reform projects. I'd be really happy working for a team called Qualifications Development, who run focus groups and interviews with teachers. They consult with ministries and they pilot assessments. So they do a lot of research work. So thinking about my own future, I can see that I'd be happy in a range of different jobs using research skills. And thirdly, I would recommend using CareerSet. I had such a great time. It was almost like a game, entering a job spec and then entering my CV and or application letter and trying to get above a 95% match. And I am convinced it's the only reason that I got some of the interviews that I did. So those would be my tips from my experiences anyway: resilience, flexibility, and using CareerSet.
Thank you so much, Jude. That was really interesting. I'm just going to, before we switch over into Stephanie, CareerSet is a tool that you have access to on the Career Service website. It's an AI-driven tool that can review your CV based on the job description. We can put a link to that in the chat. Let's move now over to Stephanie, and we'll let you go from there, Steph.
Cool, thanks. And yes, please do stop me if I talk longer than 7 minutes. I guess of everyone speaking, I probably have the most obvious research focused career. So I work as a research fellow at ODI, which is a global affairs think tank based out of London. It's sort of a standard, I guess, option when you think about what to do with a research-based degree afterwards. And I think what I want to talk about a bit is how I actually got here, because it wasn't really somewhere I intended to end up, and it wasn't really quite direct. So the most common way to get a job in the organization seems to be to start as an intern or a low-level sort of general researcher coming out of a master's degree with not much experience. And then you work internally and you work your way up for a bit, and then maybe you go back and do a PhD and come back in again. And actually even people with PhDs as well come in at more of a lower level and work up, whereas I seem to jump through a lot of that and came in about just over a year ago and sort of a more mid to senior level leading on the research program. So Yeah, I want to sort of, I guess, yeah, talk about how I got here and what worked and I guess what didn't for me in ending up in this type of job. So I guess my starting point was that I was a bit privileged, I guess, in how I thought about my own research and what I studied. And I tended to study things that I found interesting and didn't really think about their practical relevance. So my PhD was in politics, but it was looking at conceptions of the public sphere and public sphere theory, and looked empirically at particular context in the coast of Kenya, where I'm clearly not Kenyan, I'm clearly not sort of based in that area, and in the whole decolonizing agenda, it just wasn't also appropriate in thinking of working or pursuing a research career there. So I ended up with a degree I found incredibly interesting, but a sort of area of subject expertise that sort of left itself without a lot of sort of immediate practical relevance. On the other side, I guess, whereas I approached my research from thinking about what was interesting, when it came to thinking about work, I was very much driven by sort of a sense of necessity and not saying no to sort of any opportunities that came up. So I finished my master's degree when the financial crisis hit. I finished my PhD the year of Brexit, and I finished my postdoc when COVID hit. And so in that sense, and also I'm clearly not British either, living in this country. And so having settled status at least, but also being a foreigner with no family here, I sort of just took whatever I could and ended up with a job I eventually liked, and I'll say how I got here. But it was sort of that kind of thing of sort of being resilient, but also just sort of taking what you can when you can, even if it's not your dream job, and seeing in a sense then how things can fit together. And I think actually some of the sort of haphazard experiences I have enabled me to make some of that jump into a research position that wasn't necessarily an entry-level position anymore. So I finished my PhD back in the late 2016. I luckily got a sort of short-term postdoc at Cambridge. It was initially a 2 or 3 year post, but I ended up continuing to extend it, basically by taking on roles that I think a lot of postdocs normally wouldn't take. So I ended up doing a lot working around research impact, supporting the REF process, which we know from other sides of it, and also working in research admin, coordination, helping in organizing sort of coursework as well, but going sort of above and beyond and outside of the more typical postdoc activities. And I think what this allowed me to do was to end up with a profile coming out of my postdoc that wasn't just suited for an academic career, but was also one that could be appealing to organizations that are interested in funding research or interested in doing research oriented towards policy. So when COVID hit and I did not have an academic post, and I'm happy to talk about that process of thinking through that, I ended up getting a job with UKRI, which is based at Bays, but they're the body that does all the sort of cross-council research funding and organization in the UK. And what was interesting with this is that my research was completely irrelevant to getting the post. UKRI is responsible for research funding to universities, but most people that work there do not have a PhD and do not have a background in the university sector. So the reason really why I was appealing to that job was because of all the little bits of things I was doing around my PhD and postdoc. And with that, my ability to speak a bit more of the language with which they spoke about research and research impact in a body like UKRI versus how we might speak about it in academia. And so in the role itself, research was important. I was sort of leading on sort of large scale evaluations, but the way in which they spoke about research was in the context of something like the Magenta book. So these sort of government's guidances on what good evaluation methods or good research methods look like. And whereas I could sort of think across to sort of what makes for good research outside in academia sort of also speaks to what makes for good research and writing in policy. It was very much a different language. The job was fine. I got into it. My postdoc and working around impact was really valuable there. I didn't massively enjoy it, actually. I enjoyed the people quite a lot, but it wasn't really using the things I found interesting, which were thinking this more stuff around the public sphere theory, thinking about how that translates in different contexts and the sort of research I had been doing with my postdoc. So actually during that year, I was notified that ODI by some contacts that ODI was looking to set up a program around digitalization, and they were looking for researchers. And now, I guess what was interesting and why I ended up getting that post when it was sort of indicated that they wanted someone to lead on this program was not just because of my research. A lot of people have done research that looks at things like public sphere, that looks at it across digital channels. But it was because I had worked in government, I had worked in evaluation, I could speak the language of policy, and also I could do sort of good academic research, and I could think about how my research spoke to bigger policy questions. And so I think really when I think back to sort of the interview and getting that job, what mattered, it was being able to articulate my research around not what interested me, but interested sort of bigger questions within the relationship with the UK government and some other sort of international actors as well. And to help sort of structure that thinking, and also an idea about the sort of business model of these organizations as well. So where did they get their funding from? Where does that come from? And I'm almost done, I think. And so I think I sort of spent a bit of that too, because I think what I sort of want to emphasize here is that I didn't sort of have a direct intention of what I was doing. I took up opportunities that as they came, and I was willing to do things that weren't sort of the typical postdoc activities. And I think because there's so many PhDs coming out of this now, I think that really matters. And I guess in thinking through some of those sort of ad hoc things that helped me, I guess what I would say in my top 3 tips in like 40 seconds or 30 seconds or whatever I've left is one, it was really useful to be doing things first, sort of forms of non-academic writing. There's a lot of overlap with good journalism, sort of public policy writing, blog posts, I'm sorry, I don't want to say it, podcasts and that sort of thing that have actually helped me to stand out from others. So doing things that speak to the audiences you're interested in, and also speaking to people in jobs that you're interested in as well, and looking at their CVs, which I actually didn't do, but I think is a really valuable thing to do. But sort of who do you want to speak to and who's in the jobs that you'd want to do, and actually putting your writing or your work in front of them as well through public channels. Because being proactive, and that sort of, the postdoc was a bit of a, not the most ideal time. It was a lot of sort of haphazard short-term contracts, but doing various things together, I was able to cobble something that was coherent. And I guess the last thing is just be confident in what you do know. I think coming out of PhD, I didn't necessarily have a lot of confidence in my ability to sort of write or articulate myself, and also to know a subject matter well in a way that speaks to bigger issues, and having some sort of confidence in that is quite important.
Great,
and
perfect.
I think I'll stop.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. That's really interesting. We're going to move directly over into hear from Ariella.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Ariella. I work for the House of Commons. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got to where I am, but also I think because this is a slightly, people don't know that much about what committee specialists in particular do, I'm going to talk a little bit about what that job looks like, and what sorts of jobs you can get in the Commons, and for that matter in the Lords, although I don't know that much about the Lords, that sort of utilise research skills and other skills as well, that are, some of which are quite different to what you would do in academia. So a bit about myself. I got a PhD in international relations at Pembroke. I submitted it in 2011. I'd always been interested in practitioner roles, and I did a visiting fellowship at a think tank during part of my PhD. But right as we came up to the end of my PhD, the department actually got funding to embark on a 3-year project that was really similar to what I had been doing for my PhD. So I ended up kind of sticking around, and I became the postdoctoral researcher for that project, which worked with colleagues at Sciences Po, Cologne and Maastricht to study national parliamentary scrutiny of the EU after the Lisbon Treaty. So I spent 3 years working on that, and through the course of that project, we did quite a lot of engagement with practitioners, as we would refer to them then, and sort of parliamentarians and parliamentary staff. So it was always kind of a world that I was involved in some way. We interviewed them for our research, we invited them to seminars, that kind of thing. And I always thought their job seemed really interesting. Truth be told, as I came to the end of my postdoc, I didn't really have a clear sense of what I wanted to do either. I'd applied for a few fellowships unsuccessfully. Truth be told, my heart wasn't really in it, I think. I was sort of, as others have said, looking to a world of having to move really regularly, and kind of some of the elements of academic life weren't really appealing to me for a whole bunch of reasons. So I was kind of trying my hand at applications for think tanks and other things and not really getting anywhere. And sort of by complete coincidence, when we had our final conference for the project and a reception afterwards, one of the people that I've been working with a lot, who was a specialist on the Foreign Affairs Committee, told me that she was leaving her job. And I said, that's really interesting. Do you know if they're going to hire someone to do it for you, to replace you? And she said, oh, I don't know. There's all sorts of internal things, but sign up on the website. And if they do recruit for it, you'll get the job alert through. So that's what I did. And to my amazement, the job came up and I applied, and I actually managed to get through an interview, and I was successful, which again, I was really shocked by when they called me. But there you go. So I'm not sure how much you know about select committees and what they do, but just really briefly, they're cross-party committees of MPs that are tasked with scrutinising government policy and expenditure. Most of them shadow particular government departments, like in my former case, the Foreign Affairs, Department of Foreign Affairs, that's the Irish term, the Foreign Office. But there are some cross-cutting ones like the Environmental Audit Committee and Science and Tech Committee, and there are a few that are joint with the Lords, like the National Security Strategy Committee. And most of this work is carried out through inquiries. So when that happens, basically a committee decides on a particular topic that it wants to investigate in some detail. They put out a call for written submissions with some terms of reference. They'll invite witnesses for oral evidence. You probably will have seen some of that on TV, the members sitting around a horseshoe asking questions of a witness. And then it'll usually end with a report which sets out recommendations for government policy, which they may or may not accept. There are obviously lots of variations to this. There are also sorts of high profile one-off sessions that you get, sort of the circus ones, like for example, the one a couple of weeks ago with P&O ferries, but that's the kind of general system, how it works. And the main job of a specialist, which is what I did for Foreign Affairs, is to manage that process. So most committee teams will have about 3 specialists, and they also have usually 2 procedural experts, so clerks as well, and a couple of operations staff. So it's a really small team, usually about 8 to 10 people max. And as a specialist, you really run all aspects of that inquiry process on behalf of the committee. So I would help them draft their terms of reference, using my kind of knowledge to show them, okay, well, here are the key things you need to know. Here's the stuff that is already really well known. Here's where we would, add some value potentially. We recommend witnesses. So we kind of assess and digest all of the written submissions that come in, and you synthesize them for the committee. You kind of figure out what's good and what isn't very useful to you. You liaise with those witnesses, so you're kind of building external networks as well of engagement with the inquiry. And you're responsible for briefing the committee. So that involves written briefing, quite extensive written briefing often before evidence sessions. We're drafting questions for them to ask. So again, trying to pick out really what's the most important thing that we need to know. And you're also sometimes briefing them orally before evidence sessions, accompanying them sometimes on trips, both domestically and abroad, which is a whole other thing I can talk about because that's a really interesting part of the job, but also pretty exhausting. And then in the end, usually an inquiry, you're responsible for then drafting the committee's report on behalf of the chair. So that's a kind of in some ways a very academic process of sitting down and writing, but it's also a very political one because you're working really closely with the chair to identify what are the things you think the committee is going to want to say, what are the issues where you might cause a row if the chair makes a sort of recommendation. Is somebody from another party going to absolutely flip out? How do you kind of avoid those issues? And then you're also responsible sometimes on the spot for helping to draft compromise language when that's needed. So I mean, literally you're sitting there and there's 11 members looking at you going, can you come up with a sentence that's going to make this work? So it's quite an exciting job. There are other aspects to it, like building networks and assisting with correspondence, but that's the main part. I would say from a research perspective and looking particularly at the research skills that you need, most committee teams are really small, as I've said, and they can't really afford to dole out inquiries on the basis of who knows what. So I was recruited specifically as an EU expert, and I turned up on my first day and they said, so you're going to do an inquiry about Hong Kong? I said, I don't know anything about Hong Kong. And they were like, yeah, you have a couple of weeks to read as much as you possibly can about this and come back to us with something useful. So you're using your skills to learn things really quickly, get your head around an issue, often very, very fast, and pick out what are the really important bits. What are the things where a committee could add genuine value? What are the things where you'd just be repeating stuff that people already know? What are the political issues that you're going to have to be navigating? So you're doing that, and then you're presenting that, in a very digested form for committees. I've got so much more to say, so please, I will do this. No, it's good. In the Q&As, I think, just in conclusion, and I'll get to top tips really quickly, what I'll say is, it's a really great job if you are interested in working closely with a team. It's a great job if you like to be able to do things very quickly and then walk away from them, which is, I know, a little bit different to academia. It's really helps to be interested in politics. We are impartial. It's at the center of what we do. It's who we are. And I can talk more about how that works in practice, but it really helps to have an interest in what goes on here. And the last thing I would say, and I'm really happy again to talk about this in much more detail later, is that our application system is really different to most others. It's a competency-based application. We ask you to demonstrate that you have usually about 5 competencies, and we look for concrete examples of when you have actually done the thing that we're asking. So that usually requires a bit of help going through, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. And one more tiny thing, which is basically a bit like Stephanie said, a lot of it is just about taking what's offered. There's a lot of mobility within the house, and very often if you apply for a job that you want and you are on the reserve list, you will be offered something else within the next 6 months, because that's just the level of churn that we have. So be open to what's offered, because you can often find that once you're in the system, you can move around in lots of different roles. And I will stop.
Thank you very much. There's already lots of common threads coming through all of this. Let's move over to you then, Laura. Take it away. I'm just going to mute myself. Thanks.
Hey, hi everyone. My name is Laura, and I currently work as a research and evidence officer for the online harms team at Samaritans. I have been working in this role for, I think it's about 9 months now, so my career is still very much in its infancy, but I'll try and tell you as much as I know at this point. But I think it's worth flagging as well that I actually started this job as I was sort of finishing my PhD. So I got to the point where my funding had run out, needed a job, and sort of ended up juggling these different things. But I'll just talk a little bit today about my background and my role, so what exactly I do on like a day-to-day basis, and yeah, then 3 top tips for anyone else who's considering a similar career or a similar role. So my academic background, I had been in Cambridge for quite a few years. So I was here for my MPhil in criminological research, and then I went straight on to do my PhD in criminology. This was an ESRC funded PhD, and my research focused on aggression and peer influence in schools. So it had really, really strong links to psychology and mental health related issues. So there is sort of a theme, if you like, linking my academic background with my current research role. And I think I was reflecting on this earlier, but I think I just got to a point where I just wanted to change. And I feel like this is really, really common for a lot of people as they approach the end of their PhD. They just want to do something different. So I wanted to change my research focus, and I wanted to explore non-academic career options, because I had been a student for about 10 years. I wanted to know what else was out there. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. I felt as though I needed that real world experience. And even if I don't stay in a non-academic research role forever, I think it's going to give you so many skills and so much experience that you can always take back to academia if you decide to do that at some point. So prior to applying for the role that I have now, I'd actually worked with Samaritans as a lived experience advisor on one of their projects. So this was really, really valuable for learning more about the culture, but also the organisation of Samaritans, because I think a lot of people, when they hear Samaritans, they just think, oh, it's like the listening service, right? But we do so much more in addition to that. So we have a whole research and influencing team. There's a research team, a policy team, a media advisory service. I'm on the online harms team. There is so much work that goes on, in addition to the support that we provide people on a day-to-day basis. So I applied for the role of research and evidence officer on the online harms team. And this is actually separate to the research team, although I sort of work quite closely with them. If anyone does have any questions about the research team, do just email me and I can sort of pass you on to the relevant person. But the online harms team is a relatively new team at Samaritans, and we're responsible for the Online Excellence Programme, which is a 3-year partnership between Samaritans and the Department of Health and Social Care, and then the big social media companies. So we work with Facebook, we work with Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. We also work with Google, Pinterest, so loads and loads of key players in this area. And the aim of this program is really to try and reduce access to harmful content around self-harm and suicide online. So really, really topical issue at the moment. And the program is quite broad. There are lots of different strands. We have a research and insights program, which is what I primarily work on. But we also develop industry guidelines for social media platforms and other online forums. And we have an advisory service where people can contact us if they have any concerns about anything in the online space. And then we also have a suite of user resources focusing on young people. We're creating resources for parents, practitioners, and lots of practical guides to really try and help people stay safe online. So basically a huge opportunity to work in a really, really important and topical area, and to have a really practical real world impact as well. So thinking about how I use my research skills in my role, I think my primary responsibility is to develop and manage our external online harms research program. So we actually commission out research to lots of different academics at universities. So I work quite closely with them, and I do get opportunities to conduct primary research. I sort of provide day-to-day research support around data collection and data analysis. So since starting at Samaritans, I've actually gained so much practical research experience. I was primarily a quantitative researcher. I did surveys, I did stats, but now I'm doing interviews and like qualitative data analysis. So it's really allowed me to develop and expand my skills as a researcher. I also manage our online harms lived experience advisory group. So this is something that I hadn't really, it's a new thing. It's been added to my role, but it basically means that I get to work with people with lived experience to help us shape the development of our research projects, our industry guidelines, and our user resources. I also maintain and develop and manage our online harms evidence base to ensure that our industry guidelines and our policy work is informed by the best available evidence. So I'll regularly have to advise like our policy team on like a press release or a parliamentary briefing. There's a lot of work at the moment around the online safety bill. So that's been like a particularly like active area for us. And then finally, I do quite a lot of work disseminating our research findings to academic and non-academic audiences. So since starting at Samaritans, I've had the opportunity to co-write an editorial for a leading suicide prevention journal. I presented research findings at our online harms webinar to an audience of like over 230 people, and also presented our research to our partners at like Facebook and Google and Instagram. So loads and loads of opportunities to make sure that the research that we do has a really like important practical impact. So yeah, so just thinking about 3 top tips, anyone sort of considering working in this area, considering this route. Firstly, I think it's really, really useful to actively seek out opportunities to get involved with charities. So lots of charities have opportunities around lived experience work or volunteering. This gives you such an invaluable insight into the culture and the organisation of the charity and to really get a feel about whether this would be right for you. So I would really, really recommend that. I also always recommend contacting whoever's recruiting for an informal chat about the role. I think this always reflects really well on you. It shows that you're motivated and interested and you have initiative. But in my experience, it's always been really helpful for learning more about the job and getting key information that can really help you to make your application stand out. And then finally, use the careers service when you're preparing your application, when you're preparing for your interview. Honestly, like it is such an amazing service. So Becca was instrumental in helping me prepare my application. I do not think I would have got this role without her. So yeah, I honestly can't recommend the careers service enough for supporting you. Thank you.
Well, that's fabulous. We fully endorse that. Thanks, Laura. And we're going to just move on now to our last speaker, who is Imma from the British Museum.
Hi there. So I'm the curator of the medieval to modern South Asia collections at the British Museum. And in terms of my pathway to working in a research role outside academia, well, in Cambridge, I was there for BA, MPhil and PhD in the History of Art department. And I focused on South Asian visual culture from quite early on, and from my BA, my dissertation's focused on the Fitzwilliam Museum's collections of South Asian painting. And the way that history of art is taught at Cambridge is very object focused. So you would take the object as a jumping off point for exploring wider narratives. So that sort of stood me in good stead for a museum role. But while doing my PhD, I worked as an arts researcher on 3 BBC Art documentaries, focusing on a very wide range of subjects that were beyond my particular area of expertise. And I was responsible for researching and developing the series content each time. That involved writing the initial treatment, right up to final production and delivery. And it also involved liaising with worldwide arts institutions and contributors as well, organising and leading film shoots across America and Europe. And what I learned from that was how to make research accessible to a really wide audience. And I really enjoyed that experience because it was very much about storytelling. So that was a very good experience in terms of, it really made me think about ways I could make my research skills apply to a role beyond academia. But after my PhD, the curatorial position at the British Museum opened up. And well, that was it was perhaps about a year actually after I submitted the PhD. And that was 7 years ago now. So I've been at the museum for 7 years. In terms of how I use my research skills in my current role, I work really widely across the collections, both medieval and modern, and my role is really to identify stories across the collections that resonate with visitors. So I curated the medieval to modern South Asia displays in our new South Asia gallery. That involved introducing new narratives dedicated to the colonial and the post-colonial periods, which aim to amplify a more diverse range of voices and to decenter Eurocentric paradigms that had been present previously. One of the last big projects that I worked on there was a Tantra exhibition, and that involved weaving a narrative that spanned more than a millennium and included objects from around the world. And that exhibition did stem from my PhD actually, so there was quite a direct connection there. But whereas my PhD had obviously been like really focused actually particularly on the late 19th century, this exhibition was really taking not only a more global approach, but really looking at the roots of Tantra and its impact right up to the present day. And then also, of course, I had to, as part of that experience of working on the exhibition, I had to deliver talks and presentations, deliver conference papers, lots of interviews with the media, and we created a whole online program for us as well. So one thing that I really enjoy doing at the museum is communicating complex stories through display with digital innovation at their heart, but also scholarship at their heart as well. So a display that I created a few years ago called Virtual Pilgrimage focused on an immersive evocation of one of the earliest and most important Buddhist monuments in the world, which is now a ruin. And for that, I devised an approach to bring to life the donors behind the creation of that site, from a Buddhist nun to a merchant perfumer. And they were identified by ancient inscriptions that are normally overlooked by visitors. And we use new interactive smartphone technology for that. And that involved working with Google Creative Lab, scholars at SOAS, and Tamasha Theatre Company. And it really enabled us to highlight the importance of inscriptions, which are crucial for understanding the social significance of early sacred sites. So I really believe that new technologies have to be mastered by museums to bring research to new audiences. And that's something that I really enjoy doing. In terms of other ways that I have used sort of my research background in the role is I was the co-coordinator for the Global Local and Imperial Histories Research Group at the museum for a couple of years. And as part of that, I co-organized a symposium in 2018 called Exhibiting the Experience of Empire. And that explored her experiences of European imperialism with a particular focus on the British Empire could be researched and exhibited through objects. And we published the proceedings from that. And I also project managed an exhibition to coincide with that symposium, which focused on the legacy of the Haitian Revolution, which gave rise to the world's first independent Black Republic. And at the moment, I'm actually on secondment as a project curator for a big program called Reimagining the British Museum, which is a cross-departmental research and display program that involves developing briefs for new permanent galleries, along with pilot projects, which are designed to research and evaluate different collaborative methods. And so for this, we're essentially creating or developing an intellectual framework for how we can redisplay our permanent collections across the museum. And I'm also currently
just almost done there, Ariella or Imma.
Oh, okay. So
yeah,
actually, I'll end with my 3 tips. So I think it's really important to be clear about what you have to offer a prospective employer and why you want to move into a non-academic environment. And I think the key is to show the relevance of your PhD and the skills that you've gained from that and how that makes you a suitable candidate. My second tip would be really open-minded. So the research environment outside of academia can be really, really different, as you can imagine. So particularly in my case, projects have a pretty fast turnaround at times, and so it's a very different pace of work. It's much more about often the practical application of research. But what's exciting about that is that you do see the fruits of your research more quickly, and you're often juggling multiple projects, so it's quite stimulating. And my third tip finally would be actually, and this may just be my number 1 tip, is that I think it's really important to spend time really thinking about what your values are, what makes you tick, what your strengths are, what you're actually passionate about, what interests you, and what matters to you in a future career. And when you're doing that, really thinking, like exploring opportunities that are not only that are based on your interests and your transferable skills that you've developed, and also your area of interest. So really sort of trying to balance the 2 things to keep your options open. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. And I think that's what we would say as careers consultants as well, paying attention to your values and how those shift and change over time, because they do change. I mean, you may have realized that from the beginning of your PhD right through to the end. So that's really helpful. So as I say, I really do see a lot of common threads through all of those very interesting talks about being open to opportunities and things seeming ad hoc, but sometimes the ad hocness makes sense after you've got through what feels like a complicated time. Also a couple of people talking about linking the different aspects of their background, so policy or teaching, or and then bringing that together with the academic research in a role outside of academia. And then really that theme also of being able to speak to different audiences and that kind of thing in many different ways, alongside of often a different pace as well. So let's maybe pick up some of those threads. I've got some questions for you, which I'll direct to you individually, but please feel free to jump in if there's something that you'd like to add or add to the topic. So again, some of you did touch on this, but often researchers will think think about the decision if they're deciding to look at roles outside of academia as a way of having more impact for their research. Was that a motivating factor for you? And maybe let's start with Stephanie on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it was motivating sense, not sort of thinking about, impact is a difficult word, so think about, I mean, I needed to be motivated by doing something that was relevant, I think.
Yeah.
And I mean, that can be through teaching, be through other things, but I think actually doing something that tied up to issues that matter, I think was quite important for staying motivated in a job. And I think, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that like working in UKR, I didn't have an impact. I obviously did things, but it wasn't an impact that sort of I valued or I sort of wanted to contribute to. And I found that actually quite demotivating quite quickly. So yeah, it did play a role.
Yeah, I guess impact is a loaded word when it comes to research. So I guess if we think about relevance and sort of a more immediate kind of relevance too, what about you, Laura? Was that something that took you in that direction?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this was one thing that really attracted me to Samaritans, and also this role in particular. So this role has such a strong like real world focus. We have our industry guidelines, like I said, and we work really closely with social media platforms and their policies around sort of monitoring harmful content online. Our policy team is doing a lot of work at the moment campaigning around the online safety bill. So tackling online content, which encourages or assists suicide, is now like a priority harmful content in the bill. So that's something that's like a very real change, very real piece of impact that you can sort of think about. And then also our user resources. So lots and lots of practical ways to sort of help keep people safe online. So yeah, I think that was a motivating factor, definitely, and probably one of my favorite parts of the job.
Yeah, interesting. And what about you, Imma? Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So that was definitely a motivating factor for me, because I suppose I was definitely really attracted to academia, because I love the process of research, and the whole research environment, and the camaraderie of being amongst other scholars. And but I think the only thing that was a little frustrating for me was the idea that only a sort of narrow range of people would access my research outputs, whatever scholarly articles that I was publishing, or the research being confined to sort of conference environments. I really wanted to try and pursue a career that would mean I could disseminate research much more widely, and for a more popular audience. And obviously the museum sphere is a great place to do that, but that was definitely a priority for me, is to try and work in a field where I can still dedicate time to the research that I loved, but also trying to disseminate it to a wider audience.
Yeah, that kind of relevance, that's to a different group of people, isn't it? So in terms of disciplinary specialism and finding your role, how important was that to sort of landing where you are? Let's maybe start with Ariella on that.
This is an interesting question for me because, as I said before, I started off working as an EU specialist for the Foreign Affairs Committee, but was immediately doing non-EU related work because it just wasn't that salient at the time. However, as you're all aware, things changed subsequently in terms of the salience and relevance of EU issues. So I didn't actually start using my particular disciplinary specialism until a couple of years into the role. I joined in 2014. Then coming up to the referendum, I was leading on all of FAC's EU work. And then after the referendum, the government decided to create the Exiting the EU committee. So I was actually asked to move to that committee on the basis of my expertise, because at the time I was one of only a couple of people who really knew anything about the EU in the health service. For complicated reasons, that didn't quite take, and I ended up working for both FAC and Foreign Affairs, FAC and Brexit for a while. Well, for several years actually. But at that point, suddenly, when the politics change in a place like this, suddenly the thing that you know about can become really essential. So we do, in terms of our kind of broader recruitment, I think we are sort of moving towards more and more recruitment for particular subject specialisms, because committees in particular do have things that they really care about and things that they really want to know about. So I think it is really relevant. That said, it is always possible, if you're working for a committee, that you're going to end up working on something that isn't anywhere near your area of specialism, and it's
so
a matter
of the query on Hong Kong on your first day.
Exactly, which is also, as I think as Imma was saying, and others, it gives you a sort of a variety in your daily work that can also be really interesting.
Yeah, the pace change. What about you, Imma?
Oh, sorry. I think in my case, it was very, it was extremely relevant. In terms of my specialism, the actual role at the museum it was desirable to have a PhD in South Asian visual culture. So it was essential to securing the role, the PhD, really. My work on the art documentaries, of course, simply required, it could have been just a degree or a master's to work on developing those storylines, because there was such a wide range of subjects for those BBC documentaries. But for the museum role, they were looking for an expert on South Asian visual culture. The only difference was that I was expected to work across all of the collections from the medieval period onwards. So I had to, that was an education for me when I arrived, because I had to really learn about a much wider span of time, but still looking obviously at the history of South Asian visual culture.
scope increases. So we can see from all of you, you're working in a lot of very different organizations, and you come from, you know, a range of arts, humanities, social sciences backgrounds. How much did you know about this kind of work, or sort of the idea of working in research outside of academia before you decided to take this route? Can we start with you, Jude, on that?
Yeah, sure. To be completely honest, probably I didn't really know that much about it. I think I got a lot of the inspiration for where I was going to start looking for jobs outside of academia from my thesis. And in particular, it was the grey literature that gave me some pointers. I thought, well, you know, I was looking at teachers' working conditions. So a lot of my information came from grey literature that was produced by organisations like the Department for Education. There was also a select committee report about teacher retention, and FER as well, do a lot of education research, RAND. So I think that gave me some kind of inspiration about where to look. And then after that, I think I started to get some ideas when I started to think away from education. I started to think in terms of skills, and I started to think about, well, you know, this is what I was trying to allude to in the introduction. Where else do you use research skills? Well, you can use them in HR jobs, defining a company culture, looking at, you know, well-being of your employees. You can use them in marketing. So yeah, not much, but it was, yeah, it was something that I had to sort of put some effort into finding out how I could use.
But something came up through the course of your research, and sort of organizations that you encounter as well, I guess. What about you, Laura? Is it something new?
Yeah, so I think I had quite a good idea about what sort of a research role at Samaritans would involve, probably from sort of working as a lived experience advisor, and then also like the informal discussions that I had with people just about the Samaritans as a whole, but also the sort of research activities that we carry out. And I think one thing that I hadn't really appreciated was how like much other stuff there is to the role. So I'm a research and evidence officer, but the amount of time that I spent sort of solely focused on research is far, far less than I would spend if I was in an academic position. So within the online harms team, it's a team of about 5 of us, and I'm the only researcher really on the team, and then other people are working on other digital projects or like our advisory service. So lots and lots of variety. So it's not just a purely research job. You end up having to like develop a lot of other skills as well. So that was something that I probably didn't quite appreciate before stepping into the role. But yeah, it's a great thing to be able to do.
So a lot of other range of activities that will be going with it. When I speak to researchers thinking of leaving academia, often, you know, the debate is also for them thinking about the extent to which they want to give up their own research agenda and start to, you know, potentially be working on whatever gets thrown across their plate. To what extent have you been able to determine your own research agenda doing research outside of academia? I'll start with you, maybe on that, Stephanie.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think I've been lucky in a sense too, in the way I came about it, is that I was very open when I started this job, in that, well, one, having a research agenda and knowing what you sort of know what you're doing was very key to the job. And I've also kept a link with the university alongside. So when I offered the job, I didn't sort of just take it fully, but I explained that I wanted to stay in the university. So I'm still 1 day a week at Cambridge as a postdoc, doing some teaching because that's my interest. And I think, I mean, I think it's a bit of a balance, because you're working within the organizational constraints, right? And you're working sort of responding to issues that are a policy concern. So in that sense, I'm limited, but it's sort of, I guess it depends on sort of how you define your research interest. And sort of for me, I've been sort of had to force the questions I'm interested in exploring and how I want to do it to things that matter. So I guess pivoting, for lack of a better word, to thinking about, I do work around digitalization of public sphere. So thinking about in the context of Russian censorship in Russia, and working with colleagues on that too. So the context in which I work at and how I think about the questions has changed a little bit, but at least in this sector, when what you're selling is your ability to sort of ask interesting questions that matter to policy and address them in ways that can sort of help inform decision making, knowing what you know and sort of keeping your research agenda does matter. So yeah, I think there is, at least in my role, there's definitely scope for that, but you need to constantly be thinking about, why is this interesting, not just to me, but to other people, and why should they care about it? Which we always think about the sort of, so what for a good academic essay as well too, but the so what is to a different audience. And so that's where it shifts.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that in academia you have a free reign to do absolutely whatever you happen to be interested in. There's always an element of sort of justifying and situating what you're doing. What about you, Laura? What has been your experience with that?
Yeah, so I think my input has been particularly limited. So when I went into the post, our research was already commissioned. A lot of the projects had already started. So in terms of being able to sort of determine the research agenda, there wasn't really much of an opportunity to do that. And that wasn't necessarily difficult. It was just different. And I found that I've ended up learning new skills and working with different researchers. And it's actually been a really valuable experience. And I think as well, looking towards the future, there would be more potential to have more of a say in sort of driving the research agenda. And particularly as you sort of progress within the organisation, you will have sort of more autonomy around that as well.
Great. Yeah, that's interesting. How important, I know for some people it's the shifting and how you actually make that move, and you've touched on that through some of your talks about, maybe being at a conference and talking to the right person, or coming across an organization through the course of your PhD research. How important has networking been to finding your particular role outside of academia? Can we start with you, Ariella, coming back to the conference?
Yeah, and actually the point about the conference is, yes, she mentioned that she was leaving, but that had no relation in some ways to the fact that I was then able to get the job. I mean, the thing about the House of Commons application process is it is completely the same for everyone who's applying. You get the only real advantage that you have, and I think this is where the networking element is important, is when you have someone inside the organization or familiar with the organization who has a sense of what they are looking for in an applicant. So it's useful and certainly very helpful in actually kind of writing up an application to get, given how weird our application process is. But beyond that, actually, not really. I found that it was much more useful afterwards.
Yeah.
When I was particularly applying for think tanks and other jobs, I was doing lots of networking, and I wasn't really getting anywhere. So slightly counterintuitive answer.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's really interesting. I mean, it's the nature of the organization, isn't it? And it's also, I think, we talk about networking, but it is also about that informational understanding that does, that kind of networking helps you to understand how to put an application forward the way Laura had been talking about earlier, speaking to people and understanding what they're looking for so you can shape your documents better. What about you, Imma?
Yeah, I think obviously networking is really important. When it came to my position at the BM, that didn't actually come about by networking. It was, I was really lucky to secure that position. But I think it was a few years previously I had done a few weeks work experience at the museum. So I think, in the museum sector in particular, it's really, helpful while you're completing graduate studies to try and do some work experience at places like museums. But one thing I would say about networking is I think, in my experience, it has to come from a really authentic place. It has to be organic, and that's me speaking as an introvert as well. I think introverts find the idea of networking, a bit really difficult. And I think for me, it only works when I'm maybe approaching someone who shares a passion for something I'm passionate about. So I'm wanting to speak to them for that reason, not because I'm trying to climb up a career ladder. So I do think it helps when networking comes from a really authentic place. And for me, it only works that way. Otherwise, I think the artificiality of it shines through otherwise.
Yeah, I think that is really important. I've heard that from many places, and I think if you take that point and think about the authenticity of that networking and how you find it easier when it feels authentic, then you're probably networking with the right people and going in the right direction. So it's probably positive. It's good feedback in that sense. So, what about you, Jude?
I think that similarly to Ariella and Imma, the initial job as assessment manager that I had, that came through a very traditional route. There was a job advert, I applied, I got it. However, I would say that when I moved within the organisation from assessment manager to researcher, that networking was important. And I kind of resonate with what Imma was saying about the authenticity of it. I'm just nosy and interested in what people do, and I just really enjoy talking to colleagues about, you know, what they do on a day-to-day basis and what their jobs are. And so I already had, through a motivation of pure interest, well, not pure interest, I did also hope eventually that I could have a job in research. But through talking to people, I wouldn't even really classify it as networking per se. It was through talking to colleagues that got a good understanding of the work that they did, which I think was really helpful when I made the application, that I knew what kind of things they did.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to say. It's through that talking and understanding and interest, you know, and then those things that seem ad hoc and the circumstantial situation can turn into something else as well. In some larger organizations, definitely government, some of the think tanks, and even some charities, as you move forward, you know, you might move away a little bit more from day-to-day research. I mean, some of you have already talked about, you know, the roles are already broader than just the core of research, to sort of maybe more people, project management. What has been your experience with this, or what do you think about this? Maybe if we start with Stephanie on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in some ways, I think like the one thing where it sort of it increasingly moves away from research is sort of the business development side of things, at least in the think tank. So in a sense, we're lucky here too, that we do have project management teams, or the financing, the fundraising, that sort of parceled out to various different people. But in terms of having to bring in money, to knowing how your research fits, how to sell it, and the networks inside that comes with that. So I think having connections and partnerships in the role is really important, and being integrated into the sector is really important, which is not my favorite thing to do. So that's changed. And I think with the think tank type of career, not all think tanks are like this. So I didn't really mention, I did do a stint for a bit at RAND Europe, which is another think tank in Cambridge. And their senior people did less research. ODI is one where the senior people actually do research. So I think in thinking about think tanks, they're not all the same. Yeah. And that's been different for me too, is finding a role where I still will have to do research and lead on research, even as you move up, is quite important. And that's in this one, but not all of them.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see when you do join an organization what that's going to look like as the progression as you move through in terms of your own decision making before you join. What about you, Ariella?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm now in a role that doesn't involve any research at all. I'm part of the senior management team of the department, basically, that staffs all of the committees. Now I'm in that role specifically because I have this sort of policy background rather than a proceduralist or clerk background, which is what it used to be. It used to be that only those people were in charge, and now they've opened it up a little bit more. So I do have kind of overall responsibility for the strategic leadership of our policy teams. But to be honest, for me, it was something I was really happy to do. And I felt like I had sort of got to as far as I was going to go in terms of using those skills on a daily basis, and I wanted to try something different. And I enjoy the people management side of it. But there are obviously limitations on how far up you can progress while still doing a lot of that day-to-day work, and that's also true in the library service, which I didn't get to talk very much about, which is another place where researchers, you know, could potentially look to work. They do slightly different work to what we do, and in some ways are a bit more academic adjacent than we are in committees. But even there, it's kind of only so far you can go and still be doing the day-to-day research, just because the organization needs people to run it. But as I say, for me, it's been really enjoyable experience, but I know it doesn't suit everyone.
Yeah, no, and that comes back to your own values and interests as well, you know, in terms of being aware of that even as you progress through your career. Thanks very much. I'm going to ask everybody, if anybody who wants to start, you know, is there anything that you miss from academic research? I know Stephanie, you still got a hand in it. Who does anybody feel like they want to answer that? Should we start with you, Jude? Do you have anything to say on
that? I suppose sometimes I kind of miss the autonomy over the shape of your days. I think that was like a really lovely thing about working in academia, that you just had, or in my experience, I had 100% autonomy over what I did every day. Whereas now, which is motivating in a different way, you work to other people's deadlines and other people's time frames. So yeah, sometimes I miss the complete autonomy.
What about you, Imma?
Well, I think I miss teaching students actually. You know, when I was doing my PhD, I got to supervise and do some undergraduate teaching, and I really enjoyed that. And I haven't been able to do as much of that in my museum role. So, which, you know, obviously I would be naturally doing in an academic role. So, so I am co-supervising a PhD student as part of my museum role, which I'm really, really enjoying. And it's made me realise how much I miss the teaching aspect of you know, a potential academic job.
Yeah, that's great. You're able to bring that in. Laura, how about you?
Yeah, so really similar actually. The teaching, but then also just academic culture more generally. So like being able to go to like a lunchtime seminar or like go to a conference and just being part of a research centre. So yeah, it is quite a big shift. There are lots and lots of benefits of a non-academic career, but just try and figure out what's important to you before deciding.
Yeah. Stephanie.
Yeah, sorry, man, I don't mean to be like, I think the one thing I think I would just sort of emphasize with what you might miss or not is that I've found, and what I've seen from sort of colleagues in academic careers versus not, as when you're comparing non-academic research versus academic research, you're not comparing it to what we had during our PhDs. And actually academic careers involve a lot of admin. I mean, it's also marking season, so it's probably a bit biased now as well, but a lot of marking, a lot of admin, and there can be a lot of time for research in it, but the sort of freedom isn't there, and you sort of get the constraints of a career and working within a bureaucracy within academia as well. And so when you think about the trade-offs, there's really good things about freedom with research, but also it still is working within a big organization. So it's not necessarily as different as you might think. And in some ways, I almost have just as much freedom for research in ODI as I would have had in a sort of lectureship, entry-level lectureship-based role.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. When I was asking about moving, you know, away from research, that does happen in academia too. That's, you know, taking on much more admin as you move through, you know, and having to find grant money, all those kinds of tasks in academia. What about you, Ariella?
A lot like Imma, I miss teaching. That's the main thing that I would say I miss. I miss my students. I miss that kind of interaction. That was always, I think, a really enriching experience for me. So that would be primarily the thing that I miss. But I will say I've been able to do a little bit of that as kind of I've moved up in helping to mentor other specialists as they come in. So you kind of get a little bit of that same thrill of kind of helping somebody become a better version of themselves. I think you can still find that in other places, but that would be the main thing I miss.
Yeah, so moving into people management, you can kind of pick up those bits from teaching, I suppose. Yeah, that's really very interesting. Thank you all very much. I'm going to open it up now to our participants.